Hey, what is up, y'all? It's Sonia,
It's Genevieve.
And Teresa.
bringing you fresh and zesty content for your education and enjoyment.
So in this episode, we're going to talk about whether English should be America's official language in reference to the article written by Samuel Echeye Hayakawa, who was the Republican Senator of California from 1977 to 1983.
And the link for the article that we are going to be using is down in the description if you want to follow along with us.
So, this piece is one that we read in our AP Language and Composition class. So, shout out to Miss Denemy for giving us content, because there's some really good pieces we want to use in the future, too. Just some really good controversial stuff to talk about, and just some debates that I think would be great to bring up in the future as well. One of them was this piece called Bilingualism in America, and I think Sonia wants to talk about exactly what the piece is and what it was about.
But before we do that, let's introduce the author. So, S.I. Hayakawa is actually a twice immigrant, which that term for me is a little bit confusing. But his family was originally from Japan, who moved to Canada, in Vancouver specifically. And he was born in Vancouver, and he came to the U.S. and was a resident of California for some time. So I find this interesting because his point of view isn't that of a Native American-born, Euro-blooded American that, believes that English should be the only official language. Now, this is like from an immigrant aspect, which I find, that's new. So he understands the need for commonality between the races and ethnic groups, and it's a reasoning that stems from unity and not a divisive sort of exclusionary tactic, I guess. So, Sonia, take it away.
So I'm going to be trying to give a quick summary. I might just go off topic at some points because this piece really sings to me. So we're starting from paragraph 1. So he starts talking about how in World War II, Chinese immigrants had to wear badges in California so that they could separate themselves from Japanese because they did not want to be mistaken for Japanese. But when they all began to live in America together, much later, Chinese and Japanese folk realized, hey, we have a lot in common, and so they were socializing, and the main reason for this was because they spoke the same language, English. So then he goes on to talk about his appreciation of English and how he established the U.S. English, a Washington, D.C. based group that seeks an amendment to the U.S. Constitution declaring English the official language of America, regardless of what other languages are used unofficially. And then he talks about his own background as an immigrant, and because we're a nation of immigrants, we don't share the characteristics of race, religion, ethnicity, or a native language which form the common bounds of society in other countries. Think about India, where most of them speak a bunch of different languages. Even though there's 2 official languages, in Hindi and English, there's a ton of different dialects. So then he talks about India specifically in about paragraph 9. While it is true that India functions with 10 official languages, I haven't heard anyone suggest that it functions particularly well because of its multilingualism. In fact, most Indians will concede that the situation is a chaotic mess which has led to countless problems in the government's efforts to manage the nation's business. Out of necessity, English still is used extensively in India as a common language. He also references Belgium as an example for similar reasons because of the Dutch and French-speaking citizens and the chronic political instability that has resulted from that. Then we're moving into paragraphs 13 and 14. How even if we agree that multilingualism would be a mistake, some would suggest that official recognition of English is not needed, and our nation has existed for over 200 years without an official language, and the common language of English still has continued to flourish, which kind of brings up the point, like, we functioned this long without English as an official language, and it's kind of working. But then he goes more into his own argument of how he, as a former U.S. Senator from California, they spent more on bilingual education programs than any other state. I'm very familiar with both the rhetoric and reality that lie behind the current debate on bilingual education. My experience has convinced me that many of these programs are shortchanging immigrant children in their quest to learn English. And then paragraph 18 is just about him setting his record straight, how he doesn't oppose bilingual education if it's truly bilingual. Employing a child's native language to teach him or her English is entirely appropriate. What it is not appropriate is continuing to use the children of Hispanic and other immigrant groups as guinea pigs in an unproven program that fails to teach English efficiently and perpetuates their dependency on their native language. And then we are going to skip to paragraph 22, where he discusses the Berkeley lawsuit. So basically, challenged by a student body that spoke more than 4 different languages and by budgetary constraints, teachers and administrators responded with innovative language programs that utilized many methods of teaching English. That school district is now in court answering charges that the education they provided was inadequate because they did not provide transitional bilingual education for every non-English speaker. What was introduced 20 years ago as an experimental project has become, despite inclusive research evidence, the only acceptable method of teaching for bilingual education advocates. Then paragraph 24 starts the new section of this piece, the alternatives. If this method of bilingual education is not the answer, are we forced to return to the old discredited sink or swim approach? No, we're not, since as shown in Berkeley and other school districts, there are a number of alternative methods that have been proven effective while avoiding the problems of all native language instruction. Then he goes on to talk about ESL and Sheltered English, 2 programs that have helped to get children quickly proficient in English. Then paragraph 26, he introduces his persona again. My goal as a student and as a former educator is to see all students succeed academically, no matter what language is spoken. So it kind of proves he's doing this for the betterment of education in general and not because he just doesn't want English to not be the official language. And then he goes into more of why, not why, but how, I'll just quote paragraph 29. As sensitive as Americans have been to racism, especially since the days of the Civil Rights Movement, no one seems to have noticed the profound racism expressed in the amendment that created the bilingual ballot. Brown people, like Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, red people, like American Indians, and yellow people, like the Japanese and Chinese, are assumed not to be smart enough to learn English. However, no provision is made for non-English speaking French Canadians in Maine or Vermont, or Yiddish speaking Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn, who are white and thus presumed to be able to learn English without difficulty. And in 1980, voters in San Francisco encountered ballots in Spanish and Chinese for the first time, since authorizing legislation had been passed by Congress with almost no debate, roll call vote, or public discussion. Congress should be looking for other methods to create greater access to the ballot box for the currently small number of citizens who cannot understand an English ballot without resorting to the expense of requiring ballots in foreign languages. And then he closes his statement saying, if we are to prevent the expansion of policies such as these moving us forward further along the multilingual path, we need to make a strong statement that our political leaders will understand. We must let them know that we do not choose to reside in a Tower of Babel. Making English our nation's official language by law will send the proper signal to newcomers about the importance of learning English and provide the necessary guidance to legislators to preserve our traditional policy of a common language.
So that is a lot to unpack. So let's go back and let's talk about the commonality and and later talk about the bilingualism and I guess the educational impact of bilingualism. So, Jenna, do you want to start that off?
Oh, I can talk about it a little. I think what really spoke to me at the beginning is very much where he really gives that first little anecdote about the Chinese and Japanese immigrants and how they were able to connect because they both spoke English. And it's a good story that he brings up, that it is very important to know English in a country like this and how that relates to problems that other countries might have when they don't share the same language, and that having that common language, English, makes some things much easier, especially politically and socially for everybody that lives in the country.
Yeah, like legal documentation wise and just ease in general, like English as an official language would help, but I guess the issue is how do we motivate or incentivize people to learn English?
Well, then I think that's the whole point. If we have English as our official language, then of course our government function would be centered around, English in the language. So government documents, legal documents, from things to like, I don't know, like loans, everything would be in English. So that, that of course, that in and of itself gives a very good incentive for immigrants coming in to learn English, because that is quite the only way they can, I guess, function in terms of government and other economically related day-to-day movements. But then again, you bring up the point where who are we expecting to learn, or who are we placing that sort of like expectation that you must learn English? Because immigrants range from like the youngest of newborns to like an 80-year-old grandma.
Yeah,
So,
like all ages.
Right. So I guess, to what extent should you be familiar with English? Is it, I mean, obviously for the older generation, you're at that point in life where learning is definitely more challenging compared to like us, like a younger teenager. Adaptability is rather hard. So I guess, of course, would you say accommodations should be made? And what exceptions are there? How far is their extent? Should they learn English? Is it only limited to day-to-day functions? And that rule of thumb is, if they can just get by, is that enough? Or how much are they supposed to be expected to learn?
It's definitely something that would be really hard to facilitate and to figure out how exactly people should learn the language, or who should, or how they would help people learn that language. And all those little discrepancies, I think, is something that would definitely need to be thought out and thoroughly processed into a good plan. But personally, I believe that if they were just to say English will be the official language, I feel like everybody that doesn't know English would either have to know somebody that does, or have access to a way to learn it, because you can't expect to just change that language make that language officially English, and not give people resources to learn that language as well. But I feel like if you're older, like if you lived in Germany all your life and you just knew German, and then you came over to America because that's where like your family went, your family should be able to help you in with documents, and you shouldn't be forced to learn that language, because honestly, at that point, you have people that can help you, and it's should be fine having somebody that can read the English for you and translate it. But then it comes down to people that don't have that same situation, and I feel like every situation is different, which is why it's so difficult to come up with a plan.
Right, yeah. And I think that also kind of brings us into our next point. So if someone is immigrating here, what phrases should non-native speakers know for sure how to use?
Right. I guess personal example, my grandparents came here back in, I guess, the 80s, if I recall correctly, and they both have, actually my entire family has a varying different level of English capabilities. Any legal documentation, it normally falls on my mom or my dad to decipher through for my grandparents. I guess my grandma knows enough to function day to day. She can go to the store on her own. She's rather independent. She can ask for directions and all that stuff. My grandpa, on the other hand, is, I guess, more proactive. He really took it upon himself to continue his English education, and he really does try and like expand his vocabulary, which I find admirable, because at that stage in your life, it's so easy to say, I'm at this point where I'm just kind of it's plateaued, I guess. So, I mean, summarizing that, we all have the varying degrees of capability. I guess it's also up to them, evidently. On that note, I would like to transition to bilingualism within certain areas of our country. So within this article, he references contemporary political leaders like Maurice Fair, who was the former mayor of Miami, and states that language is not necessary to the system. Nowhere does our Constitution say that English is our language. And Fair also told the Tampa Tribune that within 10 years, there will not be a single word of English spoken in Miami. English is not Miami's official language, and in brackets, and one day residents will have to learn Spanish or leave. So I think that one is a very powerful and very strong and a bit abrasive statement. So what do you guys think?
I think it's definitely something that brings a different perspective to people that live in places where English is almost the only language spoken in that area or in that state, to places that do have a much higher population of people coming from countries that speak other languages, and how that's kind of influenced their society and how that language might be spoken more in their day-to-day than English. But I think it's almost the same thing from like country to country. It would be better if people all spoke the same language in that country or in multiple countries, because that just helps communication. And so the fact that he's saying that people must learn Spanish or know Spanish or leave is a very, you're right, it was a very abrasive statement. It's kind of like, oh, wow, that's definitely different than most of the rest of the country would see it. I think it's a very interesting statement because there's people there that, I know there's people there for sure that only speak Spanish and get by just fine on that. And because they know people that speak English for what they might need it for, or there's just so much built into society there for Spanish speakers that they don't need it. But that's the thing, is I feel like if the rest of the country is better off using English, because almost everybody knows it or has to know it for some part of American life, then it might be better to keep them a part of that as well. And so, as I think it's interesting to bring up the fact that maybe English might not be the direction for some cities, as a whole, it feels like English would be the way to go. It's just a very interesting statement when you think about, well, maybe not all countries or cities and states agree with the fact that English is the only language that should be spoken, or the official language that everybody must know almost.
Right, and that goes back to the whole point that the U.S. overall is a very diverse country with with some secular communities within that. You know, you have Little Havana, Chinatown, Little Koreatown. You know, it's very, it's that little niche community. When you have something as big as like in Miami, where do we draw the line? And bilingualism in, I guess, different cities and communities compared to the entire country, that also goes back to education. Having them continue to keep their mother language, or having them, I wouldn't say assimilate to pure English, that seems like a bit of cultural imperialism, which he also brings up in the article. But yeah, what are your thoughts with the whole bilingual programs that he mentions in the article?
I think it's very interesting, especially like where we live and where we go to school at Sterling Heights High School, where such a large percent of the population of kids that go there are from countries in the Middle East, and most of them speak either Arabic or another language from that area. And so it's interesting to see how programs for English language learners are used at our school and how they work versus how they might work in other places, and how he cites them in the article itself.
I guess the question there would be, is the act of accommodating those who can't, or English is not their first language, is this act of accommodating done because it's believed immigrants don't have the capacity to learn English, or is it more of like a selfless thing? And why, I guess?
Right, so the act of accommodation itself, so he's saying that it's, I guess to him, it's an implication that immigrants are, I guess, inherently, I wouldn't say inherently unable, but it's the implication that they are unable to learn English, and therefore accommodations must be made, versus this is done because, that it's what should be done. And he brings up, we do this, we accommodate the Mexicans, the Indians, the Chinese and Japanese, by having this bilingual ballot, but where is the Yiddish or French ballot for the white immigrants, who then again are presumed to learn English without much difficulty?
Yep, it's crazy to think about because it is a hard place to figure out where that line is drawn in terms of what is done out of the fact that so many people need it and use it, and what is not done because people are assumed to do it because of their race. And it's just interesting to think about, because you would think because we don't have an official language that these accommodations are needed, which I think they are. But the fact that you can't offer them to everyone, especially what you would think would be a popular language in this country. Spanish, obviously, a lot of them come from Mexico and from other places in South America. You would need an accommodation for that. But I feel like there's a lot coming from, you could say some from Canada as well, so why would we not have a French accommodation as well? And that I think is where that line is very fuzzy. And so with that, does anybody have any personal thoughts on what they think should be if English should be an official language or not, or any experience they have that you think might add to this?
So I can go. So in my household, we mainly speak English, even though French, English, and Urdu, because all my grandparents are from Pakistan, so they know Urdu. Then they immigrated to Canada, and so my parents were born in Canada, so they had to learn French and English in their school. So they grew up knowing all three languages, and when they had moved to America and had my brother and me, I couldn't pick up Urdu or French when I was young enough. I just had issues learning language, so I only know enough words to, French, I barely know anything. Urdu, I know a few more words. I don't feel the need to learn either Urdu or French right now because I live in America and everything's in English anyway, and I completely understand English. But if I ever had to live in Quebec, where it's mainly French, or Pakistan, where it's Urdu, then yeah, I would definitely have to learn it just to be able to get around and communicate. But then it comes to the point where I would only need to know enough to get around. I don't need to know how to do calculus in Urdu. I don't need to do that, so I won't learn that.
I personally believe that in order to be a functioning, contributing member and productive member of society, you must learn at least the most common language. Now, I'm not saying everyone must be the most, productive and functioning member of society. It's obviously, it depends on where your capabilities are, but I truly believe that if you are to function and you want to contribute and be a productive member of society, you have to learn English. It's just it is what it is, to have that unifying language, that is the condition. And he hits on this idea that government programs, in paragraph 16, he hits on the fact that there are some policies that at times these have come dangerously close to making the main goal of this program the maintenance of the immigrant child's native language rather than the early acquisition of English, which personally, as a Chinese American who grew up in a multilingual household, that is kind of crazy. I do not expect the government to help me maintain my Chinese roots at all. The decision to maintain and retain the, language capabilities of my mother tongue is solely on me. I do not expect anyone to do that for me. And the fact that they are that, according to him, they are that close to enforcing that rather than prioritizing language, again, has I feel very negative impacts on academic and social development later on. Personally, my dad, when he first came here, he was put in an ESL class, and I've talked with him about it, and he's like, yeah, I was behind a lot of my peers because I was put in the ESL class. So yeah, with bilingualism, there's a very fuzzy line, like Jenna said, about learning and the impact of it. So I think it's a very good thing you have in the back of your head,
I would personally, I think that even if it's not the official language of the country, to succeed in the U.S., you need to know English, or to get like to a place where you want to be comfortably in a country, you need to know that country's native language, or what most is spoken there, or what is most spoken in your area, even if it comes down to a country like India where it has so many different languages that are spoken there. And I know, like, again, my family, we're white, and English has definitely been a language in our family forever. And whenever if we've ever spoken anything else, it's been so long that none of us speak it anymore. But we also I've had an uncle and a cousin and some other people that have learned German over the years, and some of them even worked in Germany for a little bit because they knew that language. And that's the thing, is if you want to, I feel like you have to want to live in another country and be comfortable there, you need to know that language, just because that'll help you, that'll make you more comfortable with the people there, and it helps break that communication barrier that otherwise you wouldn't be able to pass if you don't know the same language. And so offering programs that would help people learn English is definitely something that I think should be implemented, but also in a way that would help others without actually forcing them to do it or doing the opposite and setting them back. So I think it's kind of crazy just to think about, and even crazier to try to set up. Once again, we would just like to give another shout out to our English teacher, Ms. Benamy, for supplying us with all of these great ideas. We have hopefully coming up as well in terms of just good articles to debate and just interesting topics to bring up as well. This is one of them. We might bring up more in the future on completely different topics, but still other debates that are very interesting and still relevant to today as well.
And on that note, thank you for listening in, and comment down below, what is your language background and what are your thoughts on the importance of an official language? Should we also have an official language? If so, why or why not?
Yep, and also be sure to let us know what other new ideas or topics that you want to see on the show. Thank you for hanging out with us, and be on the lookout for our next episode sometime next week.